Sarah Ashvale, was 3 hours down the road before she let herself breathe normally. She had not run. Running would have felt desperate, and she was not desperate. She was decided, which was an entirely different thing. There is a clarity that comes to a person who has thought about a choice for a very long time, and has finally moved past thinking into doing, and that clarity was the only thing sitting in her chest right now, occupying the space where fear and doubt used to live. She walked with her pack on her back, and her eyes on the path, and her mind on the map she had memorized 3 weeks ago. The morning was cold and dark when she left, the kind of cold that settled permanently into the northern territories around this time of year, and did not apologize for itself. Her breath made thin clouds in the air. Her boots made quiet sounds on the frost-hardened dirt. Somewhere behind her, Hollow Creek was waking up. She did not turn around to look at it. She had grown up in that settlement. 22 years of mornings in that particular cluster of stone and timber buildings on the western edge of the Northern Territories. 22 years of pack bells and shared meals and training sessions, and all the ordinary machinery of pack life. She knew every building. She knew the way the long hall smelled on cold mornings when the fire had just been lit. She knew which step outside the elder hall creaked, and which window in the medic building caught the most afternoon light, and which of the pine trees at the eastern edge had a split trunk the younger children liked to climb. She knew this place the way you know something you have lived inside for your whole life. Not fondly, exactly, but with the deep familiarity of something that shaped you whether you asked it to or not. She left it without looking back. The wolf inside her was quiet. It was almost always quiet, and that had been the central problem of her life for as long as she could remember. It was not absent. She needed to be clear about that, if only to herself. She could feel it, had always been able to feel it. A small and steady weight somewhere in the center of her chest, like an ember that refused to either burn fully or go completely dark. But it did not push the way other wolves pushed. It did not surge up against the inside of her skin when the full moon came, demanding to shift and run, and fill its lungs with cold night air. It did not assert itself in training sessions, or pack gatherings, or any of the other situations where a functioning pack wolf was supposed to make its presence known. It simply sat there, patient, contained, as though it were oriented toward something that had not yet arrived, and was perfectly prepared to wait as long as it needed to. The pack healer Gordon had examined her when she was 12 years old. He had pressed 2 fingers to the base of her throat in the way healers did when reading inner bond strength, frowned for a long time at something she could not see, and told her parents that her wolf was undersized in its connection. That phrase had followed her through the next decade like a shadow she could not outpace. Undersized in its connection. As though the problem were one of scale. As though if she could stretch the bond a little, fill it out somehow, coax it into the shape the pack needed it to be, she would finally become what the world around her expected. She had tried. For years she had tried, and she had tried properly, not half-heartedly. She completed every training exercise the pack offered for strengthening an inner bond. She attended 3 separate follow-up sessions with Gordon, where he pressed his fingers to her pulse points and frowned for a long time, and told her he was not sure what more could be done. She read every resource in the pack archive on the subject of wolf bonds, which was not a small library because Hollow Creek took its traditions seriously and maintained records going back centuries. She tried the old northern meditation practices, said to align a wolf with its host. She tried the high-intensity physical training approach one of the younger training masters suggested, sessions designed to force the wolf out through adrenaline when the calm methods failed. Nothing worked. Her wolf sat where it had always sat. Every morning she woke up exactly as she had been the morning before. She made her peace with that eventually, or she became very good at looking as though she had, which was close enough to functional. She took the administrative job because it suited her, and because she was genuinely good at it. The pack filing system was in worse shape than anyone admitted, and she had a particular ability with organization and detail that the work rewarded naturally. She ate her meals in the long hall. She attended the training sessions she was required to attend. She kept her head down and her expectations at a level she could manage, and she continued, which was what she had always been good at. Then the harvest gathering came, and Dalen happened, and continuing became considerably harder. His name was Dalen, and he was 25 when it happened. A mid-rank fighter in the pack, solid and confident, with the easy assurance of someone who had never once been given reason to doubt where he stood. They had grown up 3 houses apart in the settlement. They had trained in the same yard. She had known him, the way you know someone you see regularly, without ever quite intersecting. That passing familiarity, where you know a person's face better than their voice. The Harvest Gathering was the annual event that drew the full Hollow Creek pack together, along with visitors from 2 neighboring territories. It was loud and crowded, and full of the kind of social energy Sarah had always found difficult to sustain for more than an hour at a time. She had a system. She found her corner near the wall, held her cup, watched the room without appearing to watch it, and counted down the time until she could leave without it being noticed as rudeness. The bond spark hit her on the second night, and it hit her the way such things always do, without warning and without asking her permission. It came from somewhere below thought, a pressure building behind her sternum, a sudden and undeniable orientation toward a specific point in the crowded hall. Her wolf woke up. That was the strangest part, the part she turned over in her mind hundreds of times in the months that followed. Her wolf, quiet and still for years, woke up with a sharpness she had never felt from it before. It was fully present and fully alert and pointed, the way a compass needle points, toward something across the room. She turned. Dalen was 20 feet away. He was looking at her. She saw the recognition in his face. She was certain of that. The bond spark moves in both directions when it moves, and it had moved in both directions, and he had felt it too. She held on to that for one moment. Her wolf had produced something real. After all the years of doubt and insufficient connection, and the healer's frown, her wolf had done what wolves were supposed to do, and it had done it correctly. Then his expression shifted. She spent 11 months trying to name what moved across his face when the recognition passed. She eventually settled on the word inconvenienced. Not horrified, not angry. Inconvenienced, the way a person looks when something has presented itself at an awkward moment, and they are already calculating the cost of handling it. He did not come to her. He did not suggest speaking privately. He walked to the center of the hall, waited for the noise to settle, and spoke in the formal language of pack law, the specific phrasing used for a public bond refusal. The hall went very quiet. He said the formal words first, and then he said the rest of it, the personal part, the part that existed in no legal language at all. He said that a connection between a strong wolf and one as limited as hers would serve neither of them well, that his wolf had confirmed the decision, that some bonds, however genuine the spark, were better left unclaimed. Then he walked back to his friends. 300 people had heard every word. Then the music started again, and the night went on, and Sarah stood in her corner for exactly 3 breaths before she set down her cup and walked out of the hall. She sat on the floor of her cabin for the rest of that night and most of the next morning. When she finally got up, she washed her face and made tea and went to work, because the records did not file themselves, and she had 7 land grant renewals due by the end of the week. That was 11 months ago. She had stayed in Hollow Creek because leaving required elder council approval, which required a conversation she could not bring herself to have. She had continued going to her job. She had continued eating and sleeping and moving through the days. But her wolf had been pulling away from her in small, quiet increments ever since that night in the hall, folding further inward each month, until 2 months ago, when the full moon came, and she felt nothing from it at all. No stirring, no awareness, just the ordinary silence of a room at night. That was when she found the archive entry about Voss. She had not been looking for a healer specifically. She had been doing what she always did when something troubled her deeply, which was research, moving through the pack archive systematically until she understood the problem well enough to know what could actually be done about it. It took 3 evenings. She found 3 accounts from 3 different decades, all describing the same thing. A healer named Voss, working alone at the edge of Dead Ravine, in unclaimed territory north of the Packlands. A procedure for severing the wolf bond entirely. And in all 3 accounts, the same word used to describe the outcome. Permanent. She had sat with that word for a week before she admitted to herself what she was planning. Then she drew the map on the back of a pack record form, calculated the route to the hour, and waited for the mid-season window described in the accounts as the optimal time for the procedure. 3 days. That was how long she had before the window closed. She was using every one of them. The morning settled into gray daylight around her, as she walked deeper into the unclaimed land north of the settlement. The pine trees grew closer together, and then thinned as she gained elevation. By mid-morning she crested a long ridge and could see the land ahead rolling north toward a line of darker hills that marked the edge of the territory where Dead Ravine cut through the stone. She stopped at the top of the ridge to catch her breath and looked at the distance she still had to cover, and she thought about the morning after the procedure. She had spent a great deal of time planning that morning. She imagined waking up without the weight in her chest, without the moon awareness, without the pack hierarchy pressing against the edges of her attention, without the ongoing measurement against a standard she had never been able to meet. She imagined being simply herself, plain and defined and clear. She thought it would feel like setting down a bag she had been carrying so long she had forgotten what her hands felt like without it. She walked on. By midday she had covered ground she was pleased with, even accounting for the blister starting on her left heel. She stopped at a frozen stream and sat on a flat rock and ate part of her bread, while the thin thread of water still moving under the ice made its quiet sound beside her. She drank from her flask. She watched the stream. Her wolf stirred. The lightest possible movement, a single small shift, like a creature adjusting its position during sleep. She held still for a moment, waiting to see if it would do anything more. It did not. It settled back into its familiar quiet, and she pressed her hand flat against her chest and held it there briefly, not entirely sure what she was looking for. Then she took her hand away, stood up, and kept walking. The afternoon was longer and colder, and she moved through it without stopping. When dusk came early, as it always did in this season, she made camp at the base of a rocky slope where a stone overhang sheltered her from the wind. She wrapped in her blanket and watched the stars appear above the tree line one by one, cold and very clear. She thought about nothing in particular until sleep pulled her under. The second day was harder. Her body had expected to be done after one day, and was not pleased to discover there were two more. The blister on her left heel confirmed itself by morning, and she wrapped it in cloth torn from the edge of her spare shirt, and kept moving. The terrain became rockier and more demanding, which she found useful, because it kept her focused entirely on where she was placing her feet, and for long stretches in the afternoon, that singular focus was enough. The ravine smell reached her, before she could see any sign of the ravine itself. It was a mineral, cold smell, stone and old water, and something beneath both of those that she could not name. She stopped when she first caught it on the wind, and breathed it in deliberately, and something in her chest responded to it. Her wolf stirred again, more noticeably this time. Not dramatic, not demanding, but present enough that she pressed her hand to her chest and waited a moment before walking on. She was close. One more day. The second night passed quickly in the cold hollow she had chosen for camp. She woke before dawn and walked the last miles in the dark, with the sky moving from black through gray to pale winter morning. She found the ravine road, a narrow dirt track running along the upper edge of the ravine, winding downward toward a flat at the bottom. And there, at the end of the path, a small wooden structure with a lantern burning in the window even at this early hour. Her feet slowed without being told to. Not from fear. From the simple reality of the thing. 3 weeks of planning had produced a lantern in a window at the bottom of a path, and all the quiet decisions and cold mornings in telling herself this was the right thing were about to meet their result. She walked to the door. She raised her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles made contact. The woman standing in the doorway was old in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. Old in the way of something that had been present for a very long time and intended to remain so. Her face was deeply lined. Her eyes were pale and precise, and they moved over Sarah in one slow pass that felt less like being looked at and more like being confirmed, the way you confirm something you already knew was coming. She did not show any surprise at all. She stepped back from the door and said, quietly, "You had better come in." Sarah went in. The inside of Voss's cottage was smaller than it appeared from the outside, and it appeared small from the outside. Every surface held something. Dried bundles of plants hung from the ceiling beams in clusters, their stems tied with different colored threads, their leaves reduced to papery stillness by years of dry heat. Shelves along 3 walls held jars and boxes packed without any wasted space, each container labeled in writing so small and precise that Sarah could not read it from where she stood. Books and rolled papers occupied a low table near the hearth, in a stack that leaned slightly, but had clearly been leaning for a long time, and intended to keep doing so. The fire burning in the wide stone hearth was the warmest thing Sarah had been near in 3 days, and the heat it gave off reached her immediately, pressing through her jacket and into her cold, stiffened hands, and she stood just inside the closed door and blinked for a moment, while her eyes adjusted and her body remembered what warmth was. Voss moved past her without hurrying and went to a small metal pot sitting near the hearth coals. She carried it to the table, poured 2 cups of something that steamed, and set one on the edge nearest Sarah. Then she settled into the wooden chair closest to the fire and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her visitor with the unhurried attention of someone who was not gathering information but confirming it. "How long were you walking?" she asked. Her voice came out rougher than expected. She had not spoken to anyone in 3 days, and it showed. Voss nodded once, as though 3 days were exactly the calculation she had already made. "Sit down. You have blisters, and your left heel is wrapped in what was once a shirt." Sarah sat in the other chair, because standing with a pack on her back after 3 days of walking was something she did not need to continue doing. She picked up the cup Voss had left for her, and drank without asking what was in it. It was herbal, slightly bitter at the front and slightly sweet at the finish, and it moved through her chest and into her limbs with a warmth that was faster than any drink had a right to be. She set the cup down and looked at the healer. "You know why I am here," she said. Voss tilted her head slightly. "I know what brings people here in general. The specifics are yours to give me." So Sarah gave them. She was brief because she had never been a person who used more words than a situation needed, and this situation needed enough on its own. She told Voss about her wolf, about the examination at 12 and what Gordon had said, about 22 years of a quiet bond that never performed the way it was supposed to, about the harvest gathering and the public refusal and the 11 months after it, and the wolf pulling further inward month by month until the full moon came and she felt nothing at all. She did not describe what it had felt like to stand in the hall while Dalen spoke. That was not relevant to the procedure, and she had not come here to be understood. She had come for an outcome. Voss listened without interrupting. She sat entirely still, her pale eyes steady, not leaning forward with sympathy or backward with judgment. She simply received the information the way a good reader receives a text, without inserting herself into it. When Sarah finished, Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you understand about wolf severing?" "That it is permanent," Sarah said. "That it severs the bond connection between a wolf and its host completely, removing the host from the pack bond structure, the moon cycle awareness, and the inner connection. The host retains full human function with no remaining wolf element. And the process itself? A blood offering from both parties, burning of the pack mark, a binding word spoken during the open window." Voss studied her. "Those are the visible requirements. They are accurate." She paused. "What the archive records you read did not tell you is that a wolf severing does not stay entirely contained to the individual it is performed on." Sarah felt her attention sharpen. "Explain that." Voss reached past the arm of her chair and picked up a thin stick from a bundle near the hearth. She turned it between her fingers while she spoke, not looking at it. "A wolf does not exist in isolation. Even a quiet wolf, even one that has never shifted cleanly or connected fully with its pack hierarchy, exists in a web of relationships. Pack bonds, proximity bonds built up over years of shared space and shared territory, directional bonds formed below the host's conscious awareness. When a wolf is severed, the severance does not simply end those connections on one side. It sends a pulse along every bond line the wolf holds." "A ripple," Sarah said. "A ripple." Voss set the stick down. "Most wolves carry many light connections. Pack bonds, territory bonds, proximity bonds, formed by years of daily life in one place. The ripple along those lines is small. People on the other end feel something like unease, something like a brief disturbance, and then it settles." She held Sarah's gaze steadily. "But some wolves hold a different kind of line. Not light, not formed by proximity or time or daily habit. A line formed by recognition. The wolf recognizes something in another wolf, at a level that does not consult the host's preferences or opinions. Those lines, if the ripple travels along them, produce a very different result." Sarah was very still. "What kind of result?" "It depends on the wolf at the other end," Voss said. "If that wolf is strong, well-governed, connected deeply to its host, through years of practiced alignment, then the ripple arrives without warning, along the deep line, and strikes the connection between that wolf and its host, at whatever moment the connection is most fully expressed. A moment of open communication between them. She paused. A howl, for instance. The wolf would go silent, not permanently, but completely, and at a moment when its silence would be felt by everyone in its proximity. Sarah processed this. So if I complete this procedure, someone else's wolf is affected. If you hold a deep bond line to another wolf, Voss said, then yes. The ripple travels that line and produces the described result at the other end. I do not hold a deep bond line, Sarah said. My wolf has never formed a connection with any other wolf. It barely maintains a connection to me. The pack mark functions because it was applied at the time of my pack affiliation, not because my wolf formed any bond to the pack. There is nothing for the ripple to travel along. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Those pale eyes were very steady and very direct, and they held something that Sarah could not quite read. Something that was not skepticism, but was perhaps its cousin. Your wolf is quiet, Voss said finally. It is not disconnected. There is a significant difference between those two things, and I would encourage you to sit carefully with that difference before you ask me to remove it. I have been sitting with it for 22 years, Sarah said. I know, Voss said, and her voice was not unkind. And I am not dismissing what you have carried, but a severing performed on a wolf I cannot fully assess is a severing I will not perform. You have been walking for 3 days on insufficient food and sleep, and your wolf is in a guarded state right now, not a natural one. I cannot read a wolf accurately when its host is running on exhaustion and resolve, and not much else. She held Sarah's gaze without apology. Go back to the unclaimed land between here and the pack boundary. Rest for 3 days in territory where no pack hierarchy is pressing on your wolf's awareness. Give it space to be what it actually is, rather than what it has been compressed into by years of the pack's assessment of it. Come back to me in 3 days. If you still want this done, we will do it. Sarah stared at her. 3 days. 3 days. 3 days. I have 3 days remaining in the window. I know, Voss said. That is the window I am working within. Come back at the end of the 3 days. Sarah looked at the fire for a long moment. The wood popped. A small ember fell from the grate onto the stone hearth and died. Outside, the wind moved past the window and made the lantern flame bend slightly. You said something when you opened the door, Sarah said. You said I might be the last to ask you for this. Voss said nothing. What did you mean? The old healer looked at her fire for a moment. When she looked back, something had shifted in her expression. Not pity, not sentimentality. Something more like the look a person wears when they know the answer to a question, but understand that the person asking is not yet in a position to receive it. There are bond lines, Voss said carefully, that, once fully identified, change the nature of the question entirely. Sarah waited. Voss said nothing more. Sarah stood up. She picked up her pack. She looked once more at the healer, sitting in her chair by the fire, surrounded by her labeled jars and her hanging herbs and the accumulated weight of decades of this particular work, and she could not tell whether the old woman was being careful with her or whether she was being careful with something else. She pushed the thought aside. She had 3 days of unclaimed land camping ahead of her, which was not how she had planned to spend this week, and she needed to move while there was still light. She went out. The ravine road climbed back up from the cottage at an angle that asked more of her tired legs than she wanted to give. She climbed it anyway, moving with the automatic forward motion that had carried her through 3 days of travel, and she concentrated on the path and not on the conversation she had just had, which she was already aware of wanting to take apart piece by piece and examine, but which she did not have the energy for right now. She reached the top of the ravine road and walked north, back the way she had come, looking for the hollow she had camped in the night before. The sky was moving toward the flat gray of midday, the light too diffuse to cast proper shadows. The wind came across the unclaimed land with nothing to slow it. She pulled her collar higher and kept moving. She was so focused on the path ahead of her that she did not hear the vehicles until they were close. The sound reached her at the same time as the dust, and she turned to look back over her shoulder at the ravine road below her, where 4 dark vehicles were moving up the path from the direction of the cottage, with the practiced efficiency of people who knew where they were going and were used to getting there. She moved to the side of the road. The problem was her left knee, which had been quietly building toward complaint all morning, and chose this particular moment to register its objection properly. It gave slightly when she shifted her weight to step aside, not a collapse, just a loss of control for 1 second, and 1 second was enough. She went sideways, and the pack on her back finished the job, pulling her off balance completely, and the gravel of the road came up very fast. The pack cushioned some of the impact. Not enough. She was not unconscious, but she was not fully present either. She was somewhere between those two states, aware of the cold ground under her and the sky above, and the sound of the vehicles stopping, and boots on gravel coming toward her quickly. She felt a hand on her wrist, checking her pulse, a warm and steady grip that reached through the cold of the day and the exhaustion in her body, and landed in her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. Her wolf opened its eyes. Not to defend, not to assess threat. It simply opened its eyes and looked, with the absolute focused attention of something that had been waiting for a specific thing for a very long time, and had just found it. She did not know what it was looking at. Then the gray took her fully, and she stopped knowing anything for a while. She came back slowly, in pieces. First the warmth, which reached her before anything else did. Real warmth. The kind that came from being inside a sheltered space, rather than lying on frozen gravel. Then the feeling of something soft beneath her. Then voices, low and professional, speaking to each other with the efficiency of people who were managing a situation, rather than reacting to one. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was a practical dark material, with a small mounted light in its center. The space she was in was narrow and organized, clearly the interior of one of the vehicles she had seen on the road, fitted out with medical supplies, and a folding cot, and a small table. A woman she did not know was sitting near the far end of the space, writing in a notebook, and she looked up when Sarah moved. "Good," the woman said, in the tone of someone recording a medical milestone, rather than expressing personal relief. "You are awake. How is your head?" "Fine," Sarah said. She sat up. The blanket fell, and she caught it. She took stock of what had changed. Her knee was cleaned and bandaged. Her pack sat against the wall near her feet, positioned neatly. Her boots stood beside it, removed, and placed with the kind of care that suggested they had been handled by someone methodical. "Your knee took the primary impact," the woman said. "Nothing structural. You were dehydrated and very tired. There is water on the table beside you. I am Clara. I serve as the medical officer for this convoy." "Convoy," Sarah said. "Yes. Whose convoy?" Clara looked at her with the expression of someone choosing her words thoughtfully. She opened her mouth to answer. The door at the end of the narrow space opened, and Calum Drake walked in. Calum Drake did not stop for strangers on the road. He had learned very early in his tenure as Alpha King, which had begun 6 years ago, when he was 24, and already carrying the weight of a continent's worth of pack politics, that stopping for unscheduled things was how unexpected consequences entered your day. His schedule was carefully constructed. His route was planned. Every deviation had a cost, and the cost was measured not only in time, but in the calculations of the six-pack leaders, who watched his movements with the attention of people whose own security depended on accurately reading his. 6 packs, 6 territories. One king who had earned the submission of all of them through 6 years of decisions that held. That was the foundation of everything he had built, and the foundation was exactly as solid or fragile as his consistency. He was aware of that in the way a building is aware of its own foundation, which is to say constantly, and without drama. He was in the Northern Territories on a scheduled boundary inspection that had been on the calendar for 3 months. 4 of the 6 packs shared boundary lines that required regular verification, and he made a point of conducting these inspections personally every 2 years, because there was a significant difference between a king who sent representatives and a king who showed up himself and walked the lines. People responded differently to presence. Presence meant something in the pack world that written directives could not fully replicate. Owen had flagged the report 3 days ago during the morning briefing. Owen, whose full name was Owen Marsh, and who had served as Calum's head of security for 4 years, and was constitutionally incapable of anything that resembled alarm, had placed a single sheet of paper on the briefing table and said it had come from the Hollow Creek Pack's territorial files, added to the Crown's shared intelligence system 6 months ago, and apparently not followed up on. The report described an unlicensed healer operating near Dead Ravine, in the unclaimed territory north of Hollow Creek's boundary. It noted that the healer in question was performing procedures classified under the Crown Charter's Regulated Practices category. It was brief and poorly documented, as reports from smaller packs tended to be, but it contained enough detail to be actionable. The procedure noted was wolf severing. Wolf severing was not, strictly speaking, illegal under current Crown law. The law was murkier than Calum preferred it to be, a fact he intended to address formally in the next legislative cycle. What was illegal was performing the procedure without a registered healer's license, and what was significantly illegal was performing it on a bonded wolf, without proper disclosure of the legal and physical consequences to the individual involved. The ripple effects of a severing on a bonded wolf fell under informed consent requirements in the Charter, and those requirements were non-negotiable. Reroute to Dead Ravine, he had told Owen. Owen had noted the change on the route plan without commentary, and relayed it to the convoy drivers. This was one of the things Calum valued about Owen. The man understood that a king's reasons were his own, until he chose to share them. Owen got on with the work. The Northern Territory road that ran along the upper edge of Dead Ravine was narrow and poorly maintained, which made sense because no pack claimed responsibility for it. The convoy moved carefully, the drivers experienced with difficult terrain. Calum sat in the second vehicle and looked out at the unclaimed land passing on both sides, and thought about the report. A healer performing severances, an unlicensed practice, and the specific question of who was coming to her, and whether they knew what a severing actually entailed, and whether the informed consent that Crown law required was being provided. His experience of situations like this was that the answer to the last question was usually no, not because healers performing such procedures were necessarily malicious, but because the ripple effect was genuinely complex and genuinely counterintuitive, and required a level of knowledge about pack bond dynamics that most people did not have. He was thinking through the specifics of the legal approach when Owen's voice came through the convoy communication system. "Sir, stop call. Person down on the road." He was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped. Owen was already at the figure on the road when Calum reached them. She was a young woman, somewhere in her early 20s, and she had gone down hard, despite a pack on her back that had absorbed some of the impact. She was not unconscious, but she was not fully present either, occupying the gray space between the two, and she was muttering something too quiet and too irregular for him to follow. He crouched beside her. He checked her pulse the way he had been trained to check it long before he became a king, 2 fingers against the wrist, pressure and count. And then he looked at the wrist more carefully, because something about it caught his attention in the way his attention had been trained to be caught by things that did not look right. Her pack mark was scorched. Not faded, not damaged by weather or time. Scorched, at the edge, in the specific pattern that resulted from a pack-burning ceremony being initiated and then stopped partway through. He had seen that pattern in records, and in one case, he had handled himself, early in his reign, involving a disputed severance in the Eastern Territories. She had been to the healer. The conclusion formed quickly and completely, the way conclusions did when the evidence was clear and the pattern was familiar. She had left her pack without the pack's knowledge, walked 3 days to the healer's cottage, and either had the procedure initiated and then stopped, or had the initiation begun, and then something had interrupted it. She was on the road back, presumably, which meant she had not completed it, and she had been walking long enough on not enough to eat that her body had simply stopped cooperating. He told Owen to bring Clara forward from the third vehicle. He told the rest of the security detail to give them space but stay at perimeter. He stayed where he was, crouched beside her on the gravel road with his fingers still at her wrist. His wolf had been steady all morning in the way it was always steady, that deep, quiet alignment that he had come to rely on as his most accurate reading of any situation. His wolf read things his human attention sometimes missed, not through any mystical process, but through the particular sensitivity that a well-developed inner bond gave its host to the emotional and physical states of the world around them. He had learned to trust it, the way he trusted any well-calibrated instrument, consistently, practically, without overstating what it was. And then the woman on the road made one small unconscious sound, and her wrist was under his fingers, and his wolf went silent. Not quiet in its usual way, not the settled quiet of focus and attention. This was a different silence entirely, one he had no reference point for, because in 30 years of living with his wolf, he had never felt it do this. It was the silence of something that had stopped searching, the silence of something that had been working toward a specific recognition for a very long time, and had, in this moment, achieved it. He held still. Clara arrived beside him and took over the physical assessment with the calm efficiency that made her indispensable, and he stood and stepped back and watched her work. He watched her check the knee, note the pack mark, look at the overall physical state of the woman on the road, and he processed all of it, while some part of him that he could not fully access was still dealing with the silence in his chest. "She is exhausted more than injured," Clara said, not looking up from the knee she was examining. "The knee is the worst of it, but there is nothing structural. She has been walking on poor boots for longer than was wise." She glanced at the pack mark. "Sir, her mark is partially burned." "I see it." Clara looked at him once, quickly. Then she looked back at her patient. They moved the woman to the convoy's third vehicle, which Clara claimed for the medical assessment, and Calum returned to his own vehicle and sat in it and looked out the window and tried to understand what was happening in his chest. His wolf was still quiet. 20 minutes had passed. It was still quiet. He was not a man given to uncertainty. He had spent 6 years in a role that punished hesitation, and he had learned to make decisions with the information available, rather than waiting for perfect clarity that rarely arrived. He was decisive not from arrogance, but from the trained understanding that the cost of delay was usually higher than the cost of an imperfect decision, made quickly and then adjusted as needed. But this was not a decision. This was his wolf doing something he did not have a category for, and for the first time in 6 years of being king, Calum Drake sat in a convoy vehicle on a Northern Territory road and did not immediately know what to do next. Owen knocked and entered when Calum said to come in. He sat down across from the king and waited, which was the manner he used when he had information, and was being patient about it. "She is Hollow Creek," Owen said, when Calum looked at him. "Administrative worker. The pack records list her as a filing specialist for their land grants and boundary documents. No disciplinary history. She left the settlement 3 days ago without formal leave approval, which is a pack-level matter and not a crown matter in itself." He paused. "The pack mark is a crown matter." "It is. You are invoking the ward provision." The ward provision, written into the Crown Charter decades ago, to protect individuals who had been abandoned mid-procedure by rogue healers, classified any pack member, with an initiated but incomplete wolf severing, as a ward of the Crown. The classification was designed to ensure that no one was left in the legally and medically ambiguous state that an incomplete severing created. It was rarely invoked. It had very clear specifications. "Yes," Calum said. Owen looked at him for a half-second longer than the information required. Then he nodded. "She stays with the convoy until the matter is formally resolved." "Yes." Owen left. Calum looked out the window at the ravine road, still visible below, winding toward the cottage at its base, where a healer burned a lantern through the morning. He looked at the road for a long time, and his wolf was quiet, and he sat with that quiet and the absolute unfamiliarity of it, and tried to decide whether what he was feeling was concern or something he did not yet have a name for. He decided it was both. The convoy set up a proper camp at the rim of the ravine as the day moved toward afternoon. Standard inspection camp, efficient and organized, every element placed with the precision that came from his security detail, having done this dozens of times across dozens of territories. Clara's vehicle was positioned for patient privacy. The security perimeter was established. The cook started the evening meal without being asked. Calum did the work that the inspection called for, reviewing the boundary data his team had been collecting, communicating with the pack leaders whose territories they were moving through, handling the daily administrative functions that continued regardless of what else was happening. He was thorough, and he was present, and he was, by any external measure, entirely himself. But his wolf was still quiet, and every time he checked it, which was more often than he would have admitted to anyone, it was doing the same thing, not absent, present and completely still, aimed at something with the absolute focus of something that had been searching for a specific frequency, and had finally found it. He did not go to the medical vehicle that evening. He gave her the space of a night, and he sat with the silence in his chest, and in the morning he would find out who she was, and what had happened, and what it meant that his wolf had gone silent the moment his fingers found her pulse. He was a man who solved problems. He was a man who identified the nature of a thing, and then addressed it systematically and thoroughly. He had governed six-pack territories using exactly that approach, and he was good at it, and he intended to apply it here. He just needed, first, to sit with the fact that this was the most significant thing his wolf had ever done, and that it had done it for a woman, unconscious on a gravel road, who had walked 3 days to ask a healer to cut her wolf out. He sat with that for a long time. The fire at the center of camp burned down slowly, and the security detail changed watches, and somewhere in the third vehicle, a young woman from a small pack slept the sleep of someone who had run out of road and run out of options both at once. And Calum Drake, who had spent 30 years in complete alignment with the wolf inside him, sat in the quiet of an unanswered question and waited for morning. Sarah had seen the Alpha King twice in her life before the moment she woke up in his convoy. Once at a pack assembly 3 years ago, where he had addressed the gathered leaders from a platform at the front of a hall so large and so full that Sarah had been standing at the very back and could barely make out his face. She had seen his posture from that distance, the particular way a person stands when every person in the room has oriented themselves toward them, and the person in the center is simply continuing to exist, without any adjustment for the attention. She had noticed that. She had thought it must take either a very great deal of confidence or a very great deal of practice, and then she had gone home and filed 2 boundary reports and not thought about it again. The second time was a recording shown at a Hollow Creek Council meeting, a formal ruling on a territorial dispute between 2 packs on the eastern side of the continent. She had watched the recording while entering the meeting notes and absorbed the ruling's content without paying much attention to anything else about it. He looked different at 3 feet than he looked at the back of a large hall. That was what occurred to her first, which was a foolish thought, and she recognized it as such and moved past it immediately. He was standing inside the door of the medical vehicle with his arms crossed, and his attention on her with the completeness that she would come to understand was his default state, and the combination of the crossed arms and the attention and the particular stillness he carried made the small space of the vehicle feel considerably smaller. "Who authorized removing my boots?" she asked. Clara, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the space, doing something with her notebook, made a sound that Sarah strongly suspected was a suppressed response. Calum looked at her without changing his expression significantly. "The medical officer required access to your circulation during the assessment. I was not conscious to consent to the assessment." "No," he said, "you were not." She held his gaze. He held hers. Neither of them moved for a moment, and then Sarah reached for the water container on the small table beside her, because she was very thirsty and had been managing not to notice it, and she drank while still looking at him, which was a thing she did partly from necessity, and partly to establish early that she was not going to be the kind of person who looked away from him just because he was the Alpha King. She set down the water. "How long have I been in this vehicle?" 3 hours. "Where is the convoy going?" "Currently, approximately 4 miles north-northeast of Dead Ravine, on the Eastern Territory Road." Away from the Ravine Road, away from the path she had been on. She noted this, and kept her voice even. "I need to return to the Ravine Road." "That is not immediately possible," he said. "I am a free person on unclaimed land. You do not have the authority to restrict my movements." "Under ordinary circumstances," he said, uncrossing his arms and settling into the chair across from her that Clara had vacated at some point in the last 30 seconds. "That is entirely correct. Under Crown Law, Chapter 7, Article 14, a pack member whose wolf severing has been initiated but not completed is classified as a ward of the Crown, pending either completion of the procedure or formal voluntary abandonment. The classification is automatic and does not require the individual's advance consent, because the very situation it addresses is one in which the individual may not be in a position to manage their own legal status independently." He paused. "Your pack mark has been partially burned. The ward classification applies." Sarah stared at him. She was aware, sitting on the medical cot in a vehicle with the Alpha King watching her, of several things at once. The first was that this was real, and he meant it, and the specific legal precision with which he had quoted the provision suggested he had been thinking about it for the 3 hours she was unconscious. The second was that she had 4 years of pack administrative experience and had never once encountered this provision in any document she had filed or processed, which either meant it was genuinely obscure or that she had simply never had reason to look for it. The third was that, even if she contested it, she was in a vehicle 4 miles from where she needed to be, with a bandaged knee and no food, and contesting it was going to take longer than accepting it. She decided to gather information before she decided how much energy to spend on contestation. This law is real, she said. It is in the Crown Charter. Chapter 7, Article 14. Yes. Who wrote it? He looked at her with something that was not quite amusement, and not quite surprise, but had some quality of both buried underneath the steadiness. It was written in the period of the Third King. It was designed to address a specific pattern of harm, in which rogue healers initiated severance procedures, and then abandoned their patients, leaving them in a state that was neither wolf nor fully free of the wolf bond, which created significant medical and legal complications. I was not abandoned, she said. The law does not distinguish between abandonment and voluntary departure from the procedure site. That seems like an oversight. It is, he said, in a tone that suggested this was something he had already noted and intended to address. It is on the list for the next charter review. She looked at her boots standing against the wall. Someone had placed them there neatly, heels together. How is the ward status resolved? Either the procedure is completed, under proper legal oversight, or you formally declare your voluntary abandonment of the procedure, in the presence of a Crown officer, with full acknowledgement of your current status, and the legal implications of that status. The abandonment requires a form. It requires a declaration and a witness, and the witness must be a Crown officer. Yes. Which you are. Yes. She looked at him. Then we can resolve this now. We can resolve the abandonment component now, he said. The ward provision also requires a formal assessment of the wolf's current status by a licensed healer, which I cannot provide in this vehicle, and a Crown records update, which requires a proper Crown administrative facility. She breathed in slowly and let it out carefully. Clara was still present at the far end of the space, almost certainly recording all of this in the notebook she had been holding since Sarah woke up. The convoy was moving north. The ravine road was behind them, and the Alpha King was sitting across from her with the expression of a person who has all the relevant documents memorized and is entirely prepared to wait her out. What do you want? She asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, because she had found over 22 years of dealing with pack politics and administrative processes that the direct question was almost always faster than the approach of working around to it. He considered the question with the same focused attention he had been giving everything. To ensure the ward provision is handled correctly and that your wolf is properly assessed before any permanent action is taken. That is my legal obligation in this situation. He held her gaze. I also intend to close the healer's unlicensed practice, which I was traveling to the ravine to address before your situation became relevant. So your presence here was not about me. My presence here was about the report of an unlicensed facility performing regulated procedures, he said. You became relevant when you were on the road with a partially initiated mark. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about Voss, who had sent her away for 3 days, and who was presumably still in her cottage at the bottom of the ravine road, burning her lantern and waiting. She thought about the 3-day window, which had 2.5 days remaining. She thought about the formal abandonment declaration she could theoretically make right now in this vehicle, if it were as straightforward as it sounded, which nothing in pack law ever actually was. You will allow me to return to the healer, she said, after the assessment. I will accompany you to the healer, he said, as the relevant Crown officer for the investigation and for your ward status. I do not want a companion. I understand that. They looked at each other across the small space of the vehicle interior, and Sarah understood that this particular negotiation was done. She had not lost it, because losing implied there had been a fair contest. She had simply arrived at the limits of what was available to her, and those limits included an Alpha King who had invoked an obscure protection law and was using it with a thoroughness that was either genuinely principled or strategically convenient, or both. She looked at her pack against the wall. She looked at Clara, who had the particular focus of someone who was not going to acknowledge having heard any of this conversation, and was going to be extremely diligent about her notebook for the next several minutes. She looked at the small window and the Northern Territory road passing outside it. When do we stop for the night? She said. Approximately 2 hours, he said. Will I have a private tent? Yes. And food? Yes. He stood, which in the low ceiling of the vehicle required a slight adjustment of posture. He moved to the door, and then paused, with his hand on the door frame, and looked back at her. "I am sorry about the boots," he said. It was not an elaborate apology. It was simply a statement of fact, offered the way he offered most things, directly and without embellishment. She found it harder to contest a direct and unembellished apology than she had expected to. "They need resoling," she said. "I will have someone look at them," he said. He left. Clara put her notebook down and looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who had been waiting for permission to speak. "He really did check the boot provision himself," she said. Chapter 7, Article 14. "He had me pull the charter before you came around." Sarah looked at the door he had closed behind him. "Of course he did," she said. The camp that evening was efficient and orderly, as she had expected from a Crown inspection convoy. Her tent was set up at the edge of the main camp, small but private, with a sleeping pad and proper blankets and a lamp. The food was warm, and considerably better than anything she had eaten in 3 days. She sat at the small folding camp table outside her tent, and ate and watched the camp's activity without appearing to watch it, which was a skill she had been practicing since childhood. The security detail moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times. Owen, whose name she learned from overhearing 2 members of the detail, made a perimeter check with the regularity of a piece of machinery. The cook cleaned up the meal service with the speed of long practice. Calum himself was at the far end of the camp, visible through the gap between 2 vehicles, reviewing documents by lamp with Owen beside him. He did not look in her direction. She did not look in his, except for the 2 or 3 times she did. She went to her tent when the evening had settled fully into dark. She lay on the sleeping pad with her hands folded on her chest, and looked at the roof of the tent and took stock. She had 2 days and a half of the window remaining. She was not in legal custody, but she was also not free to travel on her own. She had a bandaged knee, and a full stomach, and the cleanest and warmest she had been in 4 days. She was in the convoy of the Alpha King, who had invoked a provision she had never heard of, quoted it from memory, and apologized with exact 3-word precision for the removal of her boots. And her wolf, which had been quiet and increasingly distant for months, was doing something she could not entirely identify. Not stirring the way it had stirred on the road or in those moments near the ravine, not the small movements of something shifting in its sleep. This was different. This was more like an awareness, a quality of attention she had not felt from it in a very long time, directed at something outside her. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and waited to see if it would settle. It did not settle. It simply continued, attentive and quiet, and entirely present, like a compass that had found its north and was not intending to look away. She stared at the roof of the tent for a long time. Then she made herself stop thinking about it and sleep, because she had 2 days of this ahead of her, and she was going to need to be rested for whatever came next. The wolf could be attentive. She could still sleep. They had managed to exist in the same body for 22 years, without requiring each other's complete cooperation. A night of ordinary sleep was not beyond them. She closed her eyes. She slept. Outside the tent, the camp's night watch made its quiet rounds, and the northern stars moved above the unclaimed land, and the Alpha King sat in his vehicle long after the lamp at the far end of camp had gone out, reading nothing, thinking about the silence in his chest that had not moved in 12 hours. The camp had a rhythm, and Sarah learned it by the end of the first full morning. Watch changes happened at 4-hour intervals, clean and quiet, one detail sliding in as another stepped back without breaking the perimeter's continuity. The cook had food ready within 30 minutes of dawn every day, which was a logistical achievement she noted with professional appreciation. Owen made 2 full perimeter walks daily, once at first light and once at dusk, moving with the economical focus of someone for whom this had become as automatic as breathing. The briefing session at the first vehicle happened at 7, always attended by Owen and 2 of the senior detail members, always concluded before 7:30. She observed all of this from the flap of her tent, sitting cross-legged with a cup of tea that had been left outside for her without her asking for it. She observed it the way she had always observed pack operations, with the attention of someone whose job required understanding how systems worked, not to use that understanding but to have it. Information about a system was never wasted. She had always believed that. She was not under guard. She had confirmed this on the first morning by walking to the edge of the camp's established perimeter and then 2 steps past it, and when no one stopped her or followed her, she walked back in and went about her day. She was a ward of the Crown, which was a legal status, not a detention. She had looked up the distinction in the Crown Charter records that Owen had directed her to when she asked for document access, with an expression suggesting he had expected her to ask. The distinction was explicit. A ward retained full freedom of movement within reasonable safety parameters. She informed Owen of this on the first morning, at approximately 6:50, before the briefing. Owen looked at her for a moment with the quality of assessment he gave everything, and then said that reasonable safety parameters in current terrain excluded solo foot travel, which meant she would need convoy transport for any significant movement. "The convoy is going places," she said. "That seems like a manageable constraint." Something moved at the edge of his face that she decided to call an almost smile. He was a controlled man, not unlike the king he served, but where the king's control had the quality of something deliberately trained, Owen's had the quality of something more natural, the easy containment of a person who simply did not feel the need to put most of what he was thinking on his face. "I will let him know you reviewed the charter," Owen said. "Please do," she said. Calum came to the folding table outside her tent on the second morning. She was sitting there with borrowed paper and a borrowed pen, working through a series of administrative problems she had been mentally cataloging for months, but had never had the uninterrupted thinking time to actually address. She was mapping the structural inefficiencies in Hollow Creek's land grant filing system, specifically, the compound errors that resulted from a category coding inconsistency introduced in a system update 7 years ago, and never corrected. It was precise, focused work, and she was doing it with the attention it deserved. He set a cup of tea on the corner of her table. Then he pulled the camp chair across from her and sat down. She looked at the tea, then at him. "Record keeping?" he said. "Administrative diagnostics," she said. "The Hollow Creek filing system has a structural problem that compounds itself over time. I have been meaning to redesign the affected sections for 2 years, but the regular workload did not allow for it. This is, apparently, the window." He looked at the papers, not a polite glance, an actual look, the kind a person gives something they are genuinely trying to read. "You manage the PAC's land boundaries, land records, boundary filings, and seasonal administrative submissions. The boundary work is the most complex because it involves cross-referencing with neighboring PACs, and the category systems are not standardized across PACs. 2 PACs in the same region will use different identifiers for the same type of land classification, which creates apparent conflicts in the filing system that are not actual conflicts in the physical territory." He looked at her papers again, and this time his attention had the quality she would come to associate with him encountering a problem he found genuinely interesting. "How many of those apparent conflicts have you identified in Hollow Creek's filings?" 11 active ones, she said. 3 of them resulted in formal disputes with neighboring PACs that required council mediation. Of the 3 mediated disputes, 2 were resolved in Hollow Creek's favor once the category coding difference was identified and corrected for. "And the third?" "The third," she said, "went against Hollow Creek because the boundary claim itself was weak, independent of the coding issue. But the coding issue was what brought it to dispute in the first place. If the filing system had been standardized correctly, the weak claim would have been internally identified before it was externally filed, and the PAC would not have spent 4 months on a mediation process they were ultimately going to lose." He was quiet for a moment. Which PACs were involved? She named them. He knew them. She could tell from the way his attention shifted slightly, and he asked 2 questions that were specific enough about the geography and the political history of the territory to confirm he had background knowledge that went beyond the general. He would, she reasoned. He inspected these boundaries personally. They talked about the filing system for close to an hour. It surprised her. She had expected him to make some brief initial inquiry and then move on to whatever the actual purpose of his visit to her table was, because she was fairly certain he had not come to discuss administrative category coding. But he stayed, and he engaged with the content seriously, and when he said something she disagreed with, about the most efficient approach to cross-PAC filing standardization, she said so, and explained why, and he listened, and then countered with a point she had not considered, and she considered it for a moment, and noted it in her margin. She made an extra notation that she had not planned to make. She was aware that she did this as she did it. She did not examine it closely. When he stood to leave, she looked up and said, "You did not come here to discuss filing systems." He paused. No, he said. But that is what we discussed. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. He walked back toward the main section of the camp without looking back, and she turned to her papers and wrote the notation, and told herself she was not going to think about the quality of that conversation, which was the most useful and direct conversation she had had in months, without any of the careful social management that pack interactions usually required from her. The third morning was different from the second, in the specific way that third days are different from second days, when something has been quietly shifting between two people, without either of them naming it. The conversations came more easily. The spaces between the words were a different quality of silence. She found herself noting things she would not have bothered noting before. Small things. The way he moved through the camp without requiring the space to adjust around him. The way the security detail clearly trusted him in the operational, rather than the deferential sense. He had been reviewing boundary documentation with Owen in the late afternoon, when a communication came through from Lord Edric of Thornfield, one of the six-pack leaders, about an ongoing boundary question in the northern range. She was sitting close enough to the conversation to overhear without intending to, and she watched Calum handle it. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice, not even slightly. He asked 2 questions, listened to the answers, gave a ruling, and ended the communication. The whole exchange took 9 minutes. Owen caught her watching afterward and said nothing, which was the most informative response he could have given her. The wolf was stirring through most of that third day, and she managed it the way she managed most things she could not fully address, by acknowledging it, and setting it to one side, and continuing with what was in front of her. But by the time the afternoon light was moving toward the flat gold of early evening, setting things to one side was becoming increasingly difficult, and she found herself at the northern rim of the camp's perimeter, standing at the edge of the ravine's upper shelf, where the rock fell away into deep shadow, and the view stretched for miles through the cold, clear air. She was not hiding from anyone. She was simply standing somewhere that was not the camp, with sufficient distance between herself and the source of the problem for her to think clearly about the problem. The wolf was not a problem. She was aware that she kept framing it as one, and that the framing was not accurate. The wolf was doing something it had not done in months, possibly years, and calling it a problem was a habit, not an assessment. She heard him approach, not the sound of footsteps but some shift in the quality of the air, and she was not surprised when he came to stand beside her. She had noticed over 3 days that he was a person who arrived in places without excessive announcement, not stealthily, but simply without making his presence into an event. He stood beside her and looked at the view the same way she was looking at it, and neither of them said anything for a few minutes, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was in itself a thing she found worth noting. "Your wolf," she said finally, because she had been thinking about his words on the first morning in the vehicle, the way he had not answered directly when she pressed him on, knowing about the ripple. He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was still looking at the view, but something in his face had shifted toward a quality she had not seen on it before, a quality of careful honesty that cost something to maintain. "In the last 3 days," he said. "Yes." "In what way?" "It went quiet," he said. "Not in the way it is usually quiet. In a way I do not have a prior experience to compare it to." She waited. "Since the road," he said. "Since I checked your pulse." It went entirely silent. He said it in the same direct voice he used for everything, with no dramatizing and no minimizing, the exact calibration of a person who has decided to say a thing accurately. "It has not returned to its ordinary state since that moment. I do not know what it means. I am still working through what it means." She turned back to the view. The ravine below them was full of deep shadow, the stone catching the last of the day's light along its upper edges. "Mine has been stirring," she said, "since the camp. It had not stirred in months before that." He said nothing. He waited, which was something he was good at, she had noticed, the kind of waiting that was not passive but attentive, the kind that made more space for you to say what you actually meant. "My wolf has been quiet since the rejection," she said. "Not absent, just increasingly withdrawn, month by month, until I stopped feeling it respond to anything at all. I decided that was damage." She paused. "I decided it was the kind of damage that would not fix itself, and the most sensible thing to do was address it directly and completely." "By going to the healer." "Yes." He looked at her, not at the view, At her. She felt the shift of his attention and did not look back at him. "What the wolf that rejected you said," he said, choosing his words with a care she could hear. "That your connection was insufficient, that it would damage a bond between you. Did you ever question that assessment?" "I had 22 years of other people's assessments to corroborate it," she said. "Gordon's examination, the training masters, the elders, the pattern was consistent." "Patterns can be consistently wrong," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You do not know enough about the situation to say that." "No," he agreed. "I do not. I am saying that consistent agreement on a diagnosis does not make the diagnosis correct, particularly when the diagnosis is being made by people who have a specific expected outcome in mind." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the steady, direct regard that she had spent 3 days learning was not aggression and was not performance. It was simply how he paid attention to things he considered important. "What is your wolf doing right now?" she asked. He considered the question. "It is still," he said. "Still in a way that is entirely new to me. Not searching, not assessing, not attending to the boundary inspection, or the camp, or any of the things it would normally be tracking. It is here." He said this last word with a particular quality, the quality of someone identifying something specific and being precise about it. "It is here, and it is not moving." She felt the wolf in her chest stir in response to that, a warm and definite movement. Not dramatic, not urgent, a simple presence, unmistakable. She looked back at the ravine. "I go back to Voss tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I am still going to do what I came here to do." He said nothing for a moment. The wind moved past them along the rim. Below, the ravine held its shadows. "All right," he said. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes, and whatever she had expected him to say, she had not expected simple acknowledgement, and the absence of argument or pressure was more unsettling in its way than argument would have been. It left her with nothing to push against. "All right," she echoed, quietly. They stayed at the rim as the light faded, and the first stars appeared above the hills. 2 people standing at the edge of something neither of them had fully named yet, and the wind moved between them, and the ravine was very deep below, and neither of them moved to leave until the dark had fully come in. He told her at breakfast on the 4th morning that he was going to the ravine with her. He said it the way he said most things, as information, clearly and without negotiation, built into the framing. Sarah picked up her tea and looked at him across the camp table and ran through the available objections in the order of their usefulness. "Professionally," he said, before she had selected one, "I need to formally assess and close the healer's facility. I have a report of an unlicensed practice conducting regulated procedures. I cannot address that by staying at the camp." "You managed to not address it for 3 days," she said. "You were recovering," he said. "Clara had not cleared you for the terrain." That was true. She had been cleared that morning, which was clearly why he was raising this now. He was thorough in his sequencing, she had noticed. He did not move to the next step until the current step was properly complete. "And if I said I want to go alone," she said. "You can say that," he said. "But the ward provision requires a Crown officer present for either the completion of the procedure or the formal abandonment declaration." He held her gaze steadily. "I am the Crown officer in this territory. There is no way for you to resolve the ward status without me being there." She looked at him for a long moment. "You designed that," she said. "I recognized that it was true," he said, with a small, deliberate quality to the words, that acknowledged the distinction, while not quite denying the design. She set down her tea. "Fine," she said. "Then we go together." They drove the convoy to the rim and walked down. Owen had looked at Calum with the expression he used for things he intended to contest, received the expression Calum used for things already decided, and stood down with the specific economy of a man who knew which arguments were worth his time. The security detail stayed at the top of the path. She walked the ravine road beside Calum in the cold morning air, and neither of them talked much, and the silence was the same kind it had been at the rim the evening before, which was a kind she had stopped trying to categorize. The lantern was burning in the window at the bottom. It seemed to always be burning. The door opened when they were still 8 feet from it. Voss stood in the doorway and looked at them. Not the quick, assessing look she had given Sarah alone. This was a longer look, moving from Sarah to Calum and then back, with with the quality of a person cross-referencing something against an internal record. Then she made a sound that Sarah had not heard from her before. She laughed. It was not comfortable laughter, and it was not warm. It was the sound of someone who has been watching the pieces of something assemble for a long time, and has just seen the final piece arrive exactly where they expected it. It was the laugh of a person reading the last page of a book they had known the ending of since the first chapter, and the knowing has not diminished the satisfaction of watching it resolve. Caleb looked at Voss with an expression Sarah had not yet seen on his face. Something had shifted in the absolute steadiness he usually carried. It lasted 2 seconds before he recovered it, but she had been close enough to see it, and she filed it away. Voss stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Both of you." The cottage was the same as Sarah had left it, warm and crowded, and carrying that particular smell of herbs and old paper and fire smoke that she had come to associate with an old and very specific kind of knowledge. Voss had arranged 3 chairs near the hearth this time. She sat in the one that was clearly hers, and waved them into the other 2 without ceremony. For a moment the 3 of them were simply sitting in the firelight, the healer and the girl from a small pack, and the king who governed 6 territories, in a cottage at the bottom of a ravine on the edge of unclaimed land, and the incongruity of it was so complete that Sarah almost smiled. "You found each other on the road," Voss said. It was not a question. "She collapsed outside the convoy," Caleb said. "Yes," Voss said. "The timing was approximately right for that." She looked at Sarah. "How is your knee? Manageable?" Voss nodded. She looked at Caleb. "And how is your wolf?" Something happened in the air of the small room. Caleb went very still, the way he went still when something required full attention, every part of him organizing itself around a point of focus. "Quiet," he said. "Since when?" "Since the road. Since I found her." Voss absorbed this with a nod. She looked at Sarah. "And yours?" "Stirring," Sarah said. The word felt strange to say aloud. She had been trying not to say it for 3 days, as though naming it made it more real than she was prepared for it to be. "On and off, since the camp." Voss nodded again, slowly, with the satisfied quality of someone confirming entries in a mental calculation they had been running for some time. "What are you confirming?" Caleb asked. His voice was exactly as level as it always was. She heard it, and she heard the thing beneath it, which was not quite audible, but was there, the thing that levelness was covering when levelness required effort. Voss looked at him with the directness she gave everything. "I told Sarah on her first visit that a wolf severing travels along bond lines," she said. "That the ripple from a severance moves outward from the host, along every connection the wolf holds, and that the depth of the impact at the other end depends on the depth of the bond line the ripple travels." "She told me that," he said. "I told her that most wolves hold light connections, and that the ripple along those is manageable," Voss said. "What I did not tell her, and what I want to tell you both now, is that the reason I sent her away for 3 days was not only to assess her wolf in a calmer state. It was because the pattern of her wolf's behavior over the past year was inconsistent with simple dormancy." Sarah looked at her. "What do you mean?" "A wolf in simple dormancy loses connection broadly," Voss said. "It withdraws from everything at roughly equal measure. Pack bond, environmental sensitivity, moon response. All of it goes quiet at similar rates." She folded her hands. "Your wolf did not do that. Your wolf maintained one specific orientation while withdrawing from everything else. It withdrew from the pack. It withdrew from the moon response, from the training responses, from the social bond connections of daily pack life. But it remained pointed." She looked at Sarah directly. "Pointed is a specific behavior. A wolf that is pointed has found a direction and is maintaining it. It does not perform for the pack because it is not interested in the pack. It is interested in what it is pointed at." The fire crackled. Caleb had not moved. Sarah was holding her breath without having decided to. "A wolf in that state," Voss said, "when it finally comes into proximity with what it has been pointed at, does not stir the way an ordinary wolf stirs. It does not simply respond to presence. It recognizes. And the wolf at the other end of that recognition, even if it has been fully active and fully governed, responds to the recognition in the only way it can." She paused. "It stops searching. It goes quiet. Because it has found what it was searching for. And in the moment of finding it, the search is simply over." Caleb did not look at Sarah. He was looking at Voss, and something in his expression had moved past the 2-second recovery he usually managed, and was simply present, unguarded, in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen. If she had completed the procedure, he said. The words came out at the same careful, deliberate pace he used for everything, but there was something under the pace that she could hear clearly now. Before the convoy, before the road. The ripple would have traveled the bond line, Voss said, and struck your wolf at whatever moment it was most fully expressed. She met his eyes without blinking. You had a formal pack acknowledgement scheduled at the end of this boundary inspection. You would have been howling with your pack, your wolf, fully open and aligned with 6 territories of connected wolves, and the ripple would have arrived at that moment. Your wolf would have gone silent mid-howl. The room was very still. 6 packs, he said quietly. They would have felt that. Every one of them, Voss said. A king's wolf going silent is not a private event. Sarah looked at the fire. She was aware that her hands were very still in her lap, and that she was making them very still deliberately, because the alternative was that they were not still at all. I did not know, she said. I did not know there was a bond. I did not know any of this. I know, Voss said simply. Your wolf knew. At some level it has always known, but a wolf cannot tell its host things in human language. It can only do what it does, which is wait, and orient, and occasionally stir when what it is waiting for comes close. It could not explain to you what it was doing. It could only do it. She looked at Sarah steadily. You spent 22 years interpreting that behavior as malfunction. Your wolf spent 22 years waiting for the thing it was pointed at. Sarah heard her own breathing. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. You sent me away for 3 days, she said finally. You suspected this might happen. That the convoy might be on this road. I suspected the timing was significant, Voss said. I did not know. But in 40 years of this work, you develop a sense for certain patterns. A wolf that is quiet in that specific way, in that specific direction, in a territory that is scheduled for a crown inspection. She was quiet for a moment. I do not make decisions based on intuition alone. I sent you back because your wolf needed to be assessed in a natural state, and that was genuinely true. What might happen on the road back was a secondary consideration. Calum turned his head and looked at Sarah. It was the first time he had looked directly at her since they sat down, and the directness of it now, after everything that had just been laid in the room between them, was different from the directness she had gotten used to over 3 days. This had a different quality, something that was honest, in a way that went below the surface level of honesty he operated at in ordinary circumstances. She met his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I need to go for a walk. She stood up and went out the door before anyone could respond, and Voss let her go without comment, and the cold morning air hit her face, and she walked up the ravine road and kept walking. She walked for 2 hours, and she covered a considerable amount of ground. She went up the ravine road to the top, past the parked convoy where Owen looked at her from the first vehicle, with the expression of a man calculating whether this fell under the reasonable safety parameters provision, and she walked past him without stopping. She walked north along the rim of the ravine, past the place she and Calum had stood the evening before, further out into the open, unclaimed land, where the rock was flat and wide and cold, and she could see for miles in every direction, and there was nothing in any of those miles that required anything from her. She walked until the camp was invisible behind her, and the sound of it was gone, and there was only the wind, and her own footsteps, and the pale winter sky overhead. She needed the miles. She needed the miles between herself and the cottage, between herself and the conversation, between herself and the exact quality of the look on Calum's face when Voss said the words that had rearranged everything. 22 years. She said it to herself, walking fast over the flat rock with her hands deep in her jacket pockets and her eyes ahead of her. She said it the way you say something that needs to be heard clearly. 22 years of a wolf that had been pointed at something and not able to explain what it was pointed at. 22 years of people reading that focused waiting as malfunction. The healer who pressed his fingers to her throat and frowned and called it undersized. The training masters who stopped directing exercises at her because her wolf refused to engage. Elder Mira, gentle and entirely wrong, suggesting she would be happier somewhere that did not remind her of her limitations. The years of trying to fix something that did not need fixing, of using every method available to her to coax her wolf into a behavior it was never going to produce, because it was not broken, It was simply busy doing something else entirely. She stopped walking. She was at the far end of the rim, well past the convoy and past any visible marker of the camp. The land fell away into the ravine on her left and stretched wide and empty on her right. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the horizon, which was flat and gray and offered no particular wisdom, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she had just heard. Her wolf had been pointed at a specific person for 22 years. A specific person who had been born into a world of power and responsibility and six-pack governance, who lived at the center of the most significant political structure in the continent, who had been fully operational and fully active and fully connected with his own wolf the whole time. Her wolf had been reaching across a distance it did not understand, toward something it recognized at a level that bypassed all of the pack social structure, and all of the healer's diagnoses, and all of the public refusals, and all of the months of quiet withdrawal. And it had simply continued, year after year, quietly, steadily, without her knowledge or consent. And she had almost cut it out. That was the thing that kept arriving, the word almost. She had walked 3 days across cold, empty land, with a blister on her left heel, and a map she had drawn herself, and she had sat in that cottage and asked the healer to make it permanent. If Voss had agreed that first night, if she had not sent Sarah away, if the procedure had been completed before the convoy arrived on the northern road, Calum would have been in the middle of a formal acknowledgement with 6 packs of wolves, and his wolf would have gone silent in front of all of them. 6 packs would have felt that. 6-pack leaders would have known something had happened to the king's wolf, and they would have been right, and the implications of that would have moved through the political structure of the entire continent. Because of her, because she had believed the wrong story about herself for 22 years, and walked to a healer to make the ending of that story permanent. She sat down on the flat rock at the rim's edge. Not dangerously close to the edge, just at it. She sat with her knees up and her arms around them, and the cold wind moving past her, and she looked at the space below the ravine rim, where the stone fell away into shadow. She thought about the rejection. She thought about Dalen standing in the center of the hall, with his practiced words and his calculation of what the bond would cost him, and she thought about her wolf pulling inward in the minutes after, and she thought about how she had spent the next 11 months assuming that pulling inward was damage, that the wolf had been hurt by the rejection and was protecting itself, that the dormancy was a wound closing over. It had not been any of those things. Her wolf had not been hurt by the rejection. Her wolf had not recognized Dalen at all. The spark she felt had been one-directional, coming from her side, from the part of her that wanted to belong somewhere, and had, in the crowded warmth of the harvest gathering, reached out toward the nearest available person, and found enough of an echo to feel like recognition. Her wolf had known the difference. Her wolf had pulled inward, not because it was hurt, but because the bond that had been presented was not the bond it had been oriented toward, and the pulling inward had been clarity, not damage. It had been her wolf saying, in the only language it had, that this was not the right thing. She had not known how to hear that. She had spent 11 months translating that pulling inward as confirmation of everything she had already been told about herself, which was that she was insufficient, and her connections were weak, and her wolf was a smaller and lesser version of what a wolf was supposed to be. It was not smaller. It was not lesser. It had been extraordinarily focused, in the way that very specific things are focused, in the way a lens is focused, which is not a weakness but the opposite of one. She pressed both hands flat against her chest. Her wolf was fully present under her hands, the fullest it had been since she could remember, awake and oriented and not moving, not searching, simply here. She had almost taken this from herself. She breathed in the cold air and breathed it out slowly. She did that several more times. She looked at the ravine. She looked at the sky. She looked at her own hands against her chest and thought about 22 years and what they had cost. And she let herself be angry about the cost, because the anger was honest, and she had always preferred honest to manageable. She heard him approach. Not footsteps. Some change in the air. The specific shift that she had learned over 3 days was Calum arriving somewhere. She did not turn. She waited. He sat beside her on the flat rock without asking if it was acceptable. He had done this before, she remembered, at the rim on the evening before. He arrived and he sat, and he did not immediately speak, and she had found each time that his presence beside her was a different quality than the presence of other people beside her had ever been. Other people's presence required her to manage something, even the people she was comfortable with. His presence did not require management. It simply was. She looked at the ravine below. "I have been angry for the last 2 hours," she said. It was the first thing she had said in 2 hours, and it came out sounding like what it was, which was the simple statement of a fact she had been carrying. "I know," he said. "Not at you. I know that too." She pulled her knees closer. "I spent 22 years believing a story about myself that was wrong," she said. "I believed it because everyone around me agreed on it. I believed it because I was thorough, and I was reasonable, and the evidence available to me seemed to support it. I believed it because I did not have access to the information that would have disproved it." She paused, "And I walked 3 days to make the ending of that wrong story permanent." He was quiet. "If Voss had done it that first night," she said, "you would have been in the middle of the formal acknowledgement. Your wolf would have gone silent in front of 6-packs. "Yes," he said. "And you would not have known why." "No," he said. "And I would have gone home and believed I had done the right thing." She looked at the ravine. "That is the part I cannot fully put down. Not the what could have happened. The not knowing. I would have been certain I had made a reasonable and informed decision, and I would have been completely wrong." He looked at her. She could feel the quality of his attention from the side without looking at him. "You made the decision with the information you had," he said. "The information was incomplete. That is not the same as the decision being wrong. It would have had the same effect." "Yes," he said. "But you are not responsible for the information you were denied." She turned and looked at him. He was very close on the flat rock, not touching, just close, and his eyes were that dark gray she had noticed on the first morning in the vehicle, and he was looking at her with the complete and unguarded attention that she had, over 3 days, learned was what he looked like when he was not managing anything. "Your wolf went quiet when you found me on the road," she said. "Yes. It has not come back to normal since." "No," he said. "And you have been governing 6-packs and conducting a boundary inspection, while your wolf sits in silence." Something shifted at the edge of his face. Not quite amusement. Something that was the cousin of it. "The inspection data is thorough," he said. "The silence is not impairing my function." "I did not say it was." She looked back at the ravine. "I am trying to understand what that feels like. 30 years of alignment, and then 4 days of nothing." "It is not nothing," he said, with a precision that told her the distinction mattered to him. "It is still. Still is different from nothing. It is there, and it is not searching, or alerting, or running any of its ordinary functions. It is simply present, the way something is present when it has found exactly where it needs to be, and is staying there." She felt her wolf move in response to that, warm and definite. "I do not know how to do this," she said quietly. "Any of this. I do not know what it looks like, or what it requires, or how to be in it. I am not the person I would have predicted ending up in this situation. I am from a small pack with an undersized bond, and I walked 3 days in bad boots to ask someone to cut my wolf out. I know," he said. "None of this was planned." "No," he said. "It was not. And you are the Alpha King." "I am." She looked at him. "Does that seem absurd to you?" He considered the question with the same full attention he gave everything. "What seems absurd to me," he said, "is that I have governed 6-pack territories for 6 years and made thousands of decisions, and I am sitting on a rock at the edge of a ravine, and the most significant thing happening in my life right now is a silence in my chest that started when I touched the wrist of a woman on a gravel road." She held his gaze. He held hers. "I am still angry at 22 years, she said. "That is a fair thing to be angry at," he said. "And I need time that belongs to me before it belongs to anything else." "I am not asking for anything today," he said. "I came to sit beside you. That is the whole of what I came to do." She looked at the horizon, the pale sky, the wide, empty land, the deep shadow below the ravine's edge, where the light had not reached all day. Her wolf was settled and warm and entirely awake, and it was not looking at the horizon. It was not looking at the sky. It knew exactly where it was, and it was not searching for anything. After a while, she said, "We should go back." "When you are ready," he said. She sat for a little while longer. Then she stood up, and he stood with her. and they walked back to the convoy along the rim of the ravine, in the cold afternoon light, without needing to say much of anything else. Some things had been said that were going to take time to absorb. That was all right. She had always been good at giving necessary things the time they needed. She was going to need quite a lot of time for this one. She was beginning to think, walking beside him with the wind at their backs and her wolf settled and present in her chest, that she was probably going to have it. They went back to the cottage, as the light was fading. Sarah had stood up from the flat rock without saying she was ready, and Caleb had stood up at the same moment without being asked, and that was the whole of what was required. They walked together back along the rim to the convoy, and then down the ravine road, and the path was steeper in the afternoon, with the light at a different angle, and she watched her footing, and he walked beside her with the careful awareness of someone who was tracking something, without making a show of tracking it. She had noticed, over 4 days, the specific quality of Caleb's attention when it was on her. It was not the attention of someone conducting an assessment or maintaining a watch. It was the attention of someone genuinely paying attention, which was different, the difference between a person looking at a thing and a person seeing it. She was still deciding what to do with being seen in that particular way, because it was unfamiliar enough that she did not have an established response to it, but she was beginning to think that the not having a response was not a problem. It was possibly the beginning of something more interesting than a response. The lantern was in the window. The door opened before they reached it. Voss looked at them as they came up the path in the fading light and said nothing for a moment. Just looked, with the satisfied quality of someone watching a calculation resolve. She stepped back from the door and let them in without a word, and they went in, and the cottage was warm and the fire was burning high, and she had added 2 more candles to the room since the morning, making it brighter than it had been. Voss sat, Sarah sat, Caleb sat. The fire moved between them. "I am not completing the procedure," Sarah said. She said it clearly, and without build-up, because she had made the decision on the walk back, and there was no reason to circle around it. "I am formally withdrawing the initiation request." Voss nodded once. She had the expression of someone for whom this was the expected result, and had been the expected result for some time. "There is a fracture," Sarah said. "You told me that the first day, from the initiation." "Yes," Voss said. "An incomplete initiation always leaves a fracture in the wolf's bond structure at the point where the procedure was interrupted. You also said it might heal on its own." "In some cases," Voss said, "in cases where the wolf does not hold a significant directed bond, the fracture heals with time and rest." She looked at Sarah with the direct, calm precision she gave everything. "In your specific situation, the fracture is not at an ordinary bond point. It is at the deepest connection your wolf holds. The initiation interrupted the wolf at the very center of its orientation. That does not heal on its own, because the orientation is not something that can simply close up. It requires confirmation. The bond must be acknowledged for the fracture to close." Caleb looked at Voss. "What does acknowledgement require?" "The wolf at the other end of the bond line makes contact with the wolf carrying the fracture, and while in contact, speaks the host's name with intention. Not ceremony, not ritual, intention." She paused. "Your wolf went silent the moment you touched her wrist on the road. That is the contact point. The contact already exists. What remains is the naming." The fire made a small sound. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving past the window with a faint sound that came and went. "That is all?" Caleb said. "That is all the fracture requires," Voss said. "The rest of what a bond becomes belongs to the 2 people in it. The fracture is the beginning, not the whole." "Loxture." Sarah looked at Caleb. She had been thinking, on the walk down from the rim, about what this moment would look like. She had tried to imagine something formal, something weighted with appropriate gravity, because the thing that was happening was significant, and significant things were supposed to carry a particular kind of gravity. But sitting in the small warm cottage with the fire between them, and the wind outside, and the healer patient in her chair, what she felt was not gravity. It was something quieter and more specific, the feeling of something that had been in motion for a very long time, finally reaching the place it had been moving toward. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and he reached out. He placed his hand over her wrist, his fingers settling over the burned edge of the pack mark, and the warmth of the contact was immediate and specific, the same warmth she had registered from somewhere below consciousness on the road, when his fingers had found her pulse, and her wolf had opened its eyes. The same contact point. The same recognition. He said her name. Not Ashvale. Not her full name with any formal weight to it. Just Sarah. 2 syllables, spoken in the clear, direct voice he used for things that mattered, with the intention Voss had described, which was something she felt as much as heard, the intention of a person who means exactly what they are saying, and is saying exactly what they mean. The fracture closed. She felt it happen. There was no other honest way to describe it. She felt it the way you feel a door that has been partially open, finally swing fully closed, the satisfying, quiet completion of something that was always meant to be in that position. The pressure she had not known she was holding released, and in the releasing, she became aware of how much she had been carrying in the weeks since the initiation, a subtle tension at the center of her chest that she had attributed to everything except what it actually was. Her wolf did not surge or cry out or do anything that could be called dramatic. It settled into a fullness that spread through her from the center outward, warm and clear and completely new. And in the settling she understood something she had not had the reference point to understand before. She had been describing the weight in her chest for 22 years as the wolf's presence, assuming that what she felt was what there was to feel, that the quiet ember was the full extent of the connection. It was not the full extent. It had never been the full extent. What she had been feeling for 22 years was the wolf at minimum capacity, most of its attention directed outward towards something else, most of its resources held in that direction, leaving only the residual for anything happening in her daily life. She had been living with a fraction of what the connection could be, and now the fraction was the whole, and the whole was entirely different. She was not small. She was not broken. She had never been either of those things. The wolf that everyone had called undersized and limited and insufficient had been, for 22 years, doing the most focused and patient and extraordinary thing she had ever heard of anything doing. It had maintained a single orientation through decades of other people's misreadings of it, through exile to the edges of pack training and public rejection, and months of dormancy, and it had simply continued to point at the thing it had recognized. Calum released her wrist carefully. He did not step back immediately. He stayed close, and she was glad of that, because the completeness of what she was feeling required a moment to integrate, and having him close meant she could take that moment without any part of her having to reach for it. She put her hand over the pack mark. The burned edge, which had been itching faintly since the initiation, was warm under her palm. She could feel, against her skin, that the burn was already beginning to fade. Not the mark itself, but the scorch, the interrupted edge that the initiation had left. It was closing the way a wound closes when the injury has been correctly addressed. "Your wolf will fully settle over the next week," Voss said. She was looking at neither of them, looking at her fire in the manner of someone giving 2 people a moment without announcing that she was giving them a moment. The fracture is closed. The bond line is acknowledged. Neither wolf is straining against an unresolved connection, which means both of you can function clearly without the low-level drain that an unacknowledged bond creates on the host. She paused. Do not try to make it into everything immediately. An acknowledged bond is a beginning. The bond that grows from it takes the time it takes. "I know," Sarah said. Voss looked at her. "Do you?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "I know what I am saying," she said. "Whether I will remember to believe it when things become complicated is a separate question." Voss made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite not one. "Fair answer," she said. She looked at Calum. "I will prepare the documentation for the facility closure you came to handle," she said. "It will take me 30 minutes. You may wait outside, or continue up the path. I will have it at the door when I am done." It was a dismissal delivered with the efficiency of someone who had many things still to do, and was allocating time to each of them accurately. They went outside. The evening had come fully in while they were inside. The temperature had dropped with the light, and the sky above the ravine rim was a deep blue that was almost purple, with the first stars just becoming visible at the highest point of it. The lantern in Voss's window was the warmest light visible. They walked a short distance up the path and stood in the evening air, without talking for a while. She could feel her wolf clearly, and she had the sense, through the acknowledged connection, of his wolf as well. That same settled stillness she had been aware of as an absence from the outside. From this side of the bond it was not absence at all. It was the most complete presence she had ever been aware of from another person. "I still do not know how to do this," she said. "Neither do I," he said. That does not concern you? He thought about it. I have governed 6-packs by learning as I went, he said. I was 24 when I took the role. I did not know how to do that either. I figured it out. He glanced at her. I expect this will be similar. Governing 6-packs and navigating a bond are not analogous situations. No, he said. But the principle applies. You move forward with what you know. You pay attention to what you learn, and you adjust. She thought about that. It was not a complicated framework. It was the kind of framework that sounded obvious until you were actually in the situation where you needed it, and then it sounded less obvious and more useful. I need to return to Hollow Creek, she said. I left without formal approval. I need to address that properly before I can do anything else. And I need to collect my things. The convoy will take you, he said. And after? He was quiet for a moment. She heard him decide something, the quality of a person landing on an answer they have been working toward. After, we figure out what is next, he said, together, and at whatever pace is honest. She looked at the stars above the ravine's rim. The first ones were clear and cold, the kind that looked like they were close enough to touch even though she knew the opposite was true. At whatever pace is honest, she repeated. Yes, he said. She turned that over. She had spent 22 years in Hollow Creek, moving at the pace that was required of her, the pace of continuing, the pace of managing what was available and not asking for more. The idea of moving at a pace that was honest, rather than efficient or acceptable or good enough, was new enough to be slightly disorienting. She thought she could probably learn to want it. The documentation came out of the cottage door 30 minutes later, placed on the front step in a folded bundle. They walked back down, collected it, and began the climb back up to the convoy. Voss's lantern burned in the window behind them as they went. It did not waver. The convoy headed north from Dead Ravine, with the evening fully dark around it, and Sarah sat in her assigned vehicle and looked out the window at the dark northern land passing, and her wolf was settled and full and entirely present, and she held that, carefully, like something she did not yet entirely know how to carry but intended to learn. The information moved faster than the convoy. That was the nature of the pack world. News traveled through the network of pack connections and communication systems, and the informal intelligence channels that pack leaders maintained like water through stone, finding every crack and gap, reaching people before any formal announcement had been made. By the time the convoy crossed back into the main settled territories 2 days after leaving Dead Ravine, the quiet around Calem's formal communication channels had already broken into something considerably noisier. Eli, the communication officer, brought the first indication at breakfast on the first morning back in settled territory. A message from Lord Edric of Thornfield, senior among the 6-pack leaders both in age and in the careful political calculation he applied to everything. The message was composed in the formal language that pack leaders used with the crown, which meant every sentence had 2 readings, the surface reading and the actual one. The surface reading was a courteous inquiry about the northern boundary inspection. The actual reading was, "There are reports of something significant, and I want to understand it before I form my position." Calem read it, handed it back to Eli and said, "Standard acknowledgement. I will address the full council at the formal session." Eli confirmed and left. Sarah, who had been at the same table and had watched this exchange, said, "That is the first one." "Third," Calem said. "The first 2 came overnight while you were sleeping." She set down her cup. Who were the other 2? Lady Nora of Westmarch, Lord Bram of Coldwater. He looked at her steadily. The ward provision invocation is in the Crown's public legal filing record. Pack leaders have access to that record. They know a ward provision was invoked in the Northern Territory, which tells them what category of situation was involved. The convoy route change was noted by Thornfield's boundary monitors, and the closure notice for Voss's facility was submitted through the standard regulatory channel, which pack administrators receive. "So they have pieces," she said. "They have enough pieces to have questions, and not enough to have answers," he said. "That is the condition in which pack leaders are least comfortable, because it means they cannot yet calculate their position. And at the formal session, you will give them answers." "Yes. About everything." He looked at her. "About everything that is a matter of Crown record," he said. "The ward provision, the acknowledged bond, the facility closure, the legal status of the person involved." He paused. "Your name will be part of the formal record. That is unavoidable." She had expected this. She had had 2 days in the convoy to expect it, and she had used those 2 days to think through the implications carefully and arrive at a place of acceptance, which was something she was practiced at. The acceptance had come more easily than she had expected, which told her something about how much had shifted in the last week. Hollow Creek will file something, she said, not a question. They already have, he said. It came through the regional administrative channel this morning. She looked at him evenly. Tell me. He did. The filing challenged the ward provision invocation on the grounds that she had left the pack without formal approval, arguing that her technical violation of pack movement protocol at the time of the invocation invalidated the invocation itself. She listened to this with the attention she gave any administrative argument she was about to dismantle. That is not how the provision works, she said. No, he said. It is not. The ward provision has no residency compliance requirement. The relevant status is the wolf's condition at the time of invocation. Pack movement protocol and Crown protective law are separate legal domains. That is exactly correct, he said. They are hoping no one checks the actual text. Or they are hoping the argument creates enough procedural delay to establish a position before the formal session resolves the matter. He set down his own cup. There is also a supplementary statement attached to the filing. She waited. From the PAC member who made the public bond refusal last year, he said. He said it with the careful precision of a person who has decided to deliver a piece of information honestly and without softening it unnecessarily, because unnecessary softening adds time and does not add value. He is arguing that his public refusal constitutes the definitive statement on your bond status, and that therefore the ward provision, if valid, involves only a standard wolf bond situation, rather than a deep bond connection, and should be handled accordingly. She was quiet for a moment. She turned this over the way she turned any administrative tactic over, looking for its structure and its weakness. He is trying to establish that my bond status is ordinary, she said, which would mean the ward provision is routine. Which would mean the situation does not rise to the level of political significance that a deep bond connection to the Crown would imply. Yes, Calum said. He wants to minimize the situation before anyone asks why the public refusal was made in the first place. That is my read, Calum said. She looked at the table. She was not feeling what she had expected to feel, sitting across from the Alpha King with Dalen's name between them. She had expected the familiar weight of the harvest gathering, the echo of 300 people in a quiet hall. Instead, she felt something else, something colder and more precise, the feeling of a person looking at a move on a board and identifying exactly what it was and what it cost. His refusal filing, she said. Was it submitted correctly? Calum's expression shifted very slightly. She had learned over the last several days to read those shifts, the small movements at the edges of his face that substituted for the larger expressions that other people deployed more freely. This one had something in it that was not quite satisfaction and not quite careful. Crown Records completed a compliance review of the filing this morning, he said. The formal bond refusal is required by Crown law to be submitted within 14 days of the public declaration. The filing in question was submitted 46 days after the event. She stared at him. 46 days, she said. Yes. That is more than 3 times the required window. It is. She understood the implications immediately, because she had 4 years of PAC administrative experience, and understood what the window requirement was for. A bond refusal, like any significant PAC legal event, was required to enter the public record promptly, so that it could be factored into subsequent legal proceedings involving either party. A refusal submitted outside the window was classified as provisional rather than finalized, requiring Crown Records review to be confirmed valid. That review was never automatic. It had to be requested. The review was never requested, she said. Correct, he said. So the refusal is provisional. It has been provisional for 11 months. Yes, she breathed in slowly. And the filing itself, she said, was the record number correct? He held her gaze. The filing was submitted under a PAC record number that belongs to a different member of Hollow Creek PAC, he said. The number differs from yours by 1 digit. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, he filed it under someone else's record. It appears so. Intentionally. The Crown Records Office is evaluating whether the discrepancy constitutes a clerical error or deliberate misfiling, he said. Deliberate misfiling of a bond-related document falls under the bond documentation fraud classification in the Crown Charter. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the harvest gathering. She thought about standing in her corner with her cup, feeling the bond spark, turning, and seeing recognition in his face. She thought about the calculation she had seen move across his expression after the recognition, the inconvenience of it. And she thought about him walking to the center of the hall and choosing the most public possible method for the refusal, and then filing the legal paperwork late and incorrectly, so that the public humiliation existed in the social record while the legal accountability stayed hidden. He had wanted the consequences to fall on her without the legal trail falling on him. "I do not need to be present for the records review," she said. "No," he said. "That is an independent administrative process. And the formal session with the pack leaders. That is in 3 days," he said, "at the main territorial hall." She looked at him. "I will be at the session." He did not try to talk her out of it or suggest she might prefer to wait elsewhere. He simply looked at her with the full attention she had grown used to and said, "Good. I want access to the filing system before the session," she said. "The territorial administrative records. I identified a boundary discrepancy in the Coldwater Irongate files that has been creating a false conflict for over a year. It can be resolved with a corrective cross-reference submission. I want to have the documentation ready before the session so it can be addressed without taking additional meeting time." Something happened in his expression that she was choosing to call appreciation, though it was restrained enough to be called several things. "Lena will give you access," he said. Lena was his senior administrative advisor, a name she had heard, and a person she had not yet met. She has been looking for the source of that Coldwater discrepancy for 4 months. "It is in the field identifier codes," Sarah said. "One pack uses pre-unification codes, the other uses the current system. The translation table has an error in a specific field, which means the same physical boundary is described in 2 different languages that the system cannot reconcile. The boundary claims are not in conflict. The filing system just does not know how to recognize that they agree." He looked at her for a moment that held its quality longer than most moments. "You found that in the public archive," he said. 2 days ago," she said. "I needed something to do on the convoy." The session 3 days later was held in the Crown's main territorial hall, a wide and high space that was clearly used for significant events and knew it. Sarah walked in beside Calum and behind Owen, and the room's attention shifted immediately, which she had expected. She kept her face even and her posture straight, and found the chair she had arranged to sit in, slightly to the side of the main table, visible, but not at the center. She had thought about the positioning carefully. Lena arrived beside her before the formal proceedings began. Lena was a sharp-featured woman, with iron-gray hair, and the specific economy of movement that came from 15 years of making complicated things happen in complicated rooms. She looked at Sarah with the focused assessment she clearly gave everything, and then she held out her hand and said, "The Coldwater notation you sent last night. Where exactly did you find the translation table error?" "Third column of the field identifier cross-reference," Sarah said, taking her hand. "Row 47. The pre-unification code for mixed-use boundary land was deprecated in the unification, but the deprecation flag was not updated in the translation table. The system reads it as an unrecognized value and generates a conflict flag." "Row 47, Lena said. "Row 47, Sarah confirmed. Lena looked at her for one more moment. Then she sat down beside her and took out her documents, and the session began. Lord Edric asked his questions with the precision of someone who had prepared them carefully, and Calum answered them with the precision of someone who was not going to give more than was asked for. When the underlying question finally surfaced, which was the nature of the bond connection involved in the Ward situation, Calum answered it directly and completely. A deep bond connection, acknowledged in the formal sense required by law. The individual involved now held the legal status of recognized bond partner of the Crown. The room absorbed this in the particular way of political rooms, which was to say quietly, and with visible calculation going on behind a surface of composed attention. Hollow Creek's objection was the third agenda item. Elder Cole, who had been sent as the formal representative, was older than Sarah remembered him, and looked like a man who knew the argument he was delivering was not going to hold, and had made his peace with that. He delivered it correctly, in the proper formal language, without embellishment. Calum pulled up the relevant charter text on the hall's display and pointed to the subsection that addressed the objection. He did not editorialize, he simply pointed. Elder Cole read it. He sat back down. The bond documentation matter was addressed next. Calum presented the findings of the Crown Records Review calmly and completely. He used the same voice he used for every significant piece of information, which was to say direct, level, without unnecessary dramatic weight. He did not look at Sarah while he spoke. She appreciated that. She was not going to make a scene, and she did not need protection from the words, but she appreciated not being watched while they were said. The filing discrepancy, the 46-day delay, the incorrect record number, the provisional status of the refusal, the bond documentation fraud classification that the Crown Records Office had applied pending completion of the review. The hall was very quiet through this. Sarah was looking at the table in front of her. She was thinking about the corrective cross-reference document she had prepared for the Coldwater Iron Gate boundary matter, which was sitting in Lena's folder and would be entered into the record at the appropriate point in the session. She was thinking about the two other filing inconsistencies she had identified in the territorial administrative records during her 2 days of system access. She was thinking about the work that was in front of her, which was considerable and real and in her specific area of ability, and she was thinking about the morning she had woken up, with a blister on her left heel, and a map in her pocket, and nothing ahead of her, except 3 days of walking toward a decision she had believed was the right one. She was glad, with a completeness she had not expected to feel, that she had not arrived at the outcome she had been walking toward. The session concluded 4 hours after it began. The pack leaders left with documentation, and revised understandings, and the various adjustments of position that a significant political development required. Lena submitted the corrective cross-reference to the Coldwater Iron Gate boundary record during the administrative portion of the session, and it was accepted without question, and 14 months of apparent dispute resolved in the time it took to enter a filing correction. Calum found her in the corridor afterward. He said, "Lena wants to know if you can stay for the working group on cross-territory administrative alignment." She looked at him. "When does it meet?" "Tomorrow morning." "I can stay," she said. Something in his face settled in the way she was coming to recognize as relief, wearing its most contained form. "There is also a guest residence on the hall's west side," he said, "if you want to be somewhere that is not a convoy vehicle tonight." "That would be," she said, "very acceptable." The evening outside the hall was cold and clear, the same northern cold she had been living in for over a week now, and it no longer felt like something she needed to brace against. It just felt like the weather. She stood in it for a moment before going inside, and she thought about Hollow Creek, where she would need to return to collect her things and formally close the administrative leave she had taken without permission. She thought about the form she would need to file for that, which she already knew the reference number of because she had designed that particular form herself 3 years ago. She thought about packing her records journals and her annotated filing system notes, and the small collection of administrative resources she had accumulated over 4 years. She thought about what she was walking toward now, instead of what she had been walking away from. She went inside. The return to Hollow Creek took 1 afternoon, and resolved in 3 hours, which was faster than she had expected, and slower than she had hoped. Elder Mira met her at the edge of the settlement with the expression of someone who had been processing recent developments for several days, and had arrived at a position of dignified acceptance. She said, with genuine care, that she hoped Sarah was well. Sarah said she was. Elder Mira said the administrative leave matter would be handled as an emergency welfare departure, which was a classification the charter allowed for situations involving unanticipated medical or safety circumstances, and that no formal disciplinary action would be entered in the record. Sarah thanked her. She did not say that she had been the one to design that classification during a filing system review 2 years ago, and had always thought it was a reasonable provision. Some things were not necessary to say. She packed her cabin in 2 hours. She had expected to feel something specific when she did it, but what she felt was mostly practical. She was good at packing. She was good at categorizing things into what was worth taking, and what had served its purpose, and could stay. Her records journals came. Her annotated filing references came. 2 books she had read multiple times and intended to read again. The small photograph of her parents from before her father had stopped looking out of windows and started looking at what was in front of him. The wolf was settled through all of it, warm and steady, not hurrying her but not holding her back. She was back in the convoy before dark. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were not what she had braced for either. She had expected complexity of a kind that required significant management, the navigation of a very large gap between what she knew how to be and what the situation called for. The gap existed. It was real, but it was not as large as she had built it in her head during the nights in the convoy, when she had been lying awake, preparing for the difficult parts. The Crown's main administrative complex was large, in the way of places that had grown to accommodate many functions over many years, adding wings and floors and corridors in a way that was more organic than planned. She got lost twice in the first week. She did not say so because she found the routes on her own, which was more efficient than asking, and she had always been more comfortable with self-correction than with announced difficulty. Lena gave her a workspace in the cross-territory administrative section on her second day, and told her in the direct, economical language she used for everything that the Coldwater Iron Gate resolution had saved 3 months of projected mediation time, and that if she had additional findings from her archive review, she should submit them as a formal assessment report. She submitted the report on her 4th day. It covered 7 filing inconsistencies across 4 territorial archives, including the data migration error from 3 years ago that had been generating phantom boundary conflicts. Lena read the whole thing in Sarah's presence, which took 40 minutes, and then looked at her and said, "How long have you been doing this?" 4 years in Hollow Creek's system, Sarah said, but the analytical approach, longer. Lena put down the report. "I have 12 open cases in the cross-territory filing system that have been unresolved for between 6 months and 2 years, she said. "If you have the same eye for them that you had for these 7, I want you on them." Sarah said, "When do you want me to start?" She started that afternoon. The work was the thing she had always been able to count on, and it did not disappoint her here. It was more complex than Hollow Creek's system by several orders of magnitude, not because the principles were different, but because the scale was, and she found, to her own surprise, that the scale was something she took to naturally. Her attention for detail did not degrade at greater volume. It organized itself more efficiently. She had always been good at finding the structural patterns that generated problems, rather than just addressing the individual problems themselves. And structural patterns at the 6 territory level had more variation in them, which made the finding more interesting, rather than more difficult. She worked long hours. She was aware of this as a habit, and not entirely certain whether it was productive or avoidant, and she watched herself for the signs of the latter. She did not think it was avoidant. She thought it was genuinely the work pulling at her attention, which was a feeling she had always trusted. Calum found ways to intersect with her that were not forced and were not absent. This was, she came to think, a specific skill of his that she had underestimated. He was a person who did not hover and did not disappear. He appeared at the places where presence was appropriate and did not appear at the places where it was not. And his calibration for the difference was accurate enough that she stopped bracing for misjudgments after the first week. He brought tea to her workspace on mornings when she was there early. Not every morning, not as a performance, but often enough that the tea became reliable, without becoming a demand. He asked about the work specifically, not generically, and listened to the answers with the same focused quality he brought to everything. He told her about the boundary inspection findings that were still being processed, and about the legislative draft he was developing to address the healer licensing gap in the Crown Charter, and she found these conversations easy, in the same way she had found the administrative discussions in the camp easy, direct, without the social management that ordinary pack interactions had always required from her. She told him, on a Friday evening 3 weeks in, while they were looking at a territorial map he had unrolled on the large table in his working office, that she had been thinking about the Silverhorn Territory's boundary records, and had noticed an inconsistency that might account for the grazing rights dispute that had been generating friction between Silverhorn and Duskwood for 8 months. He looked at where she was pointing on the map. He looked at her. He said, "Show me." She showed him. He understood it in 4 minutes. He sent a message to Lady Petra of Duskwood and Lord Aldous of Silverhorn that evening, outlining the proposed resolution, and both leaders responded within 2 hours in the affirmative, and an 8-month territorial friction ended on a Friday evening over a territorial map. She was aware that this was not how she had expected her life to go. She was aware of it, with a quality that was not ironic, and was not disbelieving. It was simply the awareness of a person who has discovered that the path they are on is considerably different from the path they were on a month ago, and who was genuinely not sure how to make sense of the difference, except by continuing forward and paying attention. The wolf made it easier. The wolf was the constant, through all of it, the thing that did not need interpretation or management, the thing that simply was what it was. It was fully present in a way that she had not understood was possible before Voss's cottage. She had spent 22 years describing herself as a person with a quiet wolf, and that had been true in the sense that the wolf was not loud. But loudness had nothing to do with what it felt like to carry a connection that was whole. She did not know how to explain the difference between the two except by saying that she had not known there was a difference until the difference was inside her. She stopped thinking of her wolf as a separate thing that lived in her chest somewhere. She stopped monitoring it from a distance. It was simply part of being herself, the way breathing was part of being herself, and this felt so obvious and so simple that she could not quite explain why it had been unavailable to her for the first 22 years. She thought she knew. The wolf had been whole the whole time. The distance had been hers. The full moon arrived on a clear, cold night, and she was ready for it, in the way you are ready for something you have been moving toward with your eyes open. The gathering was held in the wide valley between the two long ridges at the center of the Crown's northern territory, where the land opened out enough to hold 6 packs worth of people and provide room for what the gathering required. Firelight marked the perimeter in wide arcs. The 6-pack territories arrived in the hours before midnight, and the valley filled with people and voices and the specific quality of anticipation that gathered people who were about to shift together always carried. She stood at the edge of the Hollow Creek delegation. Her formal pack transfer to Crown status had been initiated but not yet completed, so Hollow Creek was technically still her territory, and she stood where that placed her without argument. The Hollow Creek members nearby were not hostile. They were navigating the same recalibration that everyone in the territory was navigating, which was what to do with something new that they had not entirely seen coming. She understood that. She was navigating it herself. The Hollow Creek members nearby gave her a little extra space. She did not take that as rejection. She took it as people figuring out appropriate distance while things settled, which was a reasonable and human response. Calum came to stand beside her before the formal proceedings opened. She felt him arrive before she heard him, which she had come to accept as simply how this worked, this specific awareness of him that had nothing to do with her eyes or ears. He stood beside her and looked at the valley filling with firelight, and she stood beside him and looked at the same thing, and neither of them said much, and the wolf in her chest was entirely at ease. The formal acknowledgement opened the gathering. The 6-pack leaders made their declarations. The territory statements were spoken in the order the charter required, from Thornfield through Duskwood, with the Crown acknowledgement at the center of the sequence. And then Calum moved to the center of the valley, to the traditional position for the king's opening, and the gathering went to the particular quiet that large gatherings find when something significant is about to happen. She watched him shift. She had seen shifts before. She had grown up in a pack. She had watched shifting in training yards and at full moon gatherings, and at the assembly events she had attended over 22 years. But she had never watched from this position, with a wolf that was fully awake and fully present, and paying complete attention to exactly what it was watching, and she had never watched him specifically. His shift was clean, the way very well-aligned things are clean. No struggle, no drama. A complete and coherent transition from one form to another, and the wolf that stood at the center of the valley when it was done was large and very dark and utterly still. The same quality of stillness she had come to recognize as his. The gathering was quiet around him, the way gatherings went quiet for a thing that commanded it. He raised his head. She moved to the tree line. She moved there because that was where she needed to be, not because anyone had told her to, and she understood without needing it explained that this was her instinct rather than a rule, and that her instinct could be trusted. The tree line was the edge where the firelit gathering met the dark open land beyond, and it was the place from which she wanted to do this. She stood at the tree line and she looked at the moon. It was full and white and clear above the valley, the kind of moon that made everything it touched look like it had been present since the beginning of things. She had looked at full moons from windows, and from cabin floors, and from the edge of the Hollow Creek training yard, for 22 years. She had looked at them in the year after the rejection, with the specific quiet of someone watching a thing happen that they could not participate in. She had looked at the last one from a cold camp on the second night of her walk to Dead Ravine, with no feeling at all, just the knowledge that the moon was there, and something in her was not. She looked at this one with her wolf entirely awake. She did not wait for the formal sequence. She did not wait for someone to tell her where she fit. Her wolf knew where it fit, and she trusted her wolf. And the moon was there, and the valley was full of people and wolves and firelight, and the specific energy of six-packs gathered together. And she had spent 22 years waiting for something she had not known how to name. She shifted. It was not what she expected, which was the first honest thing she could say about it. She had expected difficulty. She had expected some residual reluctance from the body that had been performing the shift incorrectly, or insufficiently, or not at all for so many years. She had expected to have to work for it. There was no working. The shift was simply the next thing, as natural as the next breath, as complete as a word spoken without searching for it. She came through the other side, and she was at the tree line in the frost, and she was her wolf, and her wolf was her, and there was no distance between them. She was not small. She had always believed she would be small. The wolf that everyone had described as undersized and limited and insufficient. The wolf that had failed to perform in training sessions and failed to respond to the moon and failed to connect with the pack in the ways the pack required. She stood in the frost at the tree line, and she was not small. She was exactly what she was, which was complete, which was the only measure that had ever actually mattered. The formal howl sequence had begun in the valley. She could hear it from the tree line, the king's voice opening first, clear and deep and carrying through the cold air with the authority of something that had been doing this for a very long time. Then Thornfield, then Westmarch, then Coldwater, then Irongate, then Silverhorn, then Duskwood, the 6 territories answering in the order the charter specified, the sound building and layering the way sound does when many voices join the same thing. She waited. She was not in the formal sequence. She had no territory entry point yet, no designated place in the order. But she was here, and her wolf was awake and full, and pointing at the thing it had been pointing at for 22 years, and she had waited long enough. At the center of the valley, the dark wolf raised its head a second time, and paused. A half-second pause, barely a beat. Not in any formal protocol, not scripted, not planned. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for the wolf at the tree line to understand that it was being waited for. One wolf making space for another to find its timing. One wolf saying, quietly and without words, that this beginning belonged to them both. She threw her head back. The howl came from somewhere she had not had access to before. It came from the place where 22 years of waiting finally had an outlet. From the wolf that had been whole and patient, and exactly itself through all of it. From the center of a connection that had been maintained at enormous cost across an enormous distance, by something that simply did not give up. It rose through her and went out into the valley, and over the ridge, and into the dark, cold sky above the Northern Territory, and it was not small. The valley answered. 6 packs, all of them, the full voice of the gathering joining and carrying, and the sound was so complete that she felt it in her chest, along with her wolf, felt it the way you feel something that is too big to process with the ordinary faculties, and so goes directly to the part of you that simply receives things, without needing to understand them. And then the ravine answered. Dead Ravine was miles from the valley. There was no ordinary explanation for what she heard. But the valley had its own geography, its own stone walls and curved ridgelines, and the echo that found her was unmistakable. Wide and full and carrying in it the particular resonance of old stone that has held the sound of many things for a very long time. It came back to her from the direction of the ravine, from the place where she had sat on a flat rock and been very angry at 22 years, from the path where she had gone down on bad boots, and a man she had not known had found her pulse, and his wolf had gone quiet. She had come to that place to erase her wolf. She was howling on a hillside instead. She held the note until she was ready to release it, until she had given it everything she had. When she let it go, the valley was still full of sound, and her wolf was full and settled and entirely itself, and the moon above the Northern Territory was exactly the same moon it had always been, cold and white and entirely indifferent to what happened below it. She shifted back at the tree line. She stood in the frost for a moment, herself again, her breath making clouds in the cold air. She felt the wolf in her chest, the way she had been feeling it for 4 weeks now, which was as part of herself, rather than an occupant of herself, integrated in a way that she was still learning to carry, but was learning. The gathering continued in the valley below. She walked back into it. She walked back into the firelight and the six-packs, and the sound of the gathering settling after the formal sequence, and the Hollow Creek members near the edge saw her come back from the tree line, and she did not explain anything to them, and they did not ask. She had stopped explaining herself some years ago, and she had stopped apologizing for the parts of herself that did not fit cleanly into other people's expectations, even longer ago than that. Caleb shifted back at the center of the valley, as the formal sequence concluded. She saw him move through the gathering toward her, and she watched him come, and her wolf was warm, and the night was cold, and there was a great deal ahead of her that she did not yet know how to navigate. She was not afraid of what she did not know how to navigate. She was a person who figured things out by moving toward them and paying attention. She always had been. The difference was that she knew that now, rather than calling it something lesser. He reached her at the edge of the firelight. "That carry well?" he asked. The question was quiet, meant only for her. She looked at the valley, full of firelight and people, and the fading echoes of six-packs worth of voices. "To the ravine," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him beside her, the settled warmth of his presence, the wolf in her chest, warm in return. "Good," he said. She looked up at the moon, then at the valley, then at the path ahead of her, which was not a path she had planned, and was not a path she had expected, and was entirely hers. "What is next?" she said. "On the working group agenda for tomorrow." He looked at her with something in his face that was not amusement, and was not amusement. "The Silverhorn Eastern files," he said. "I reviewed them on Thursday," she said. "I have notes." "Of course you do," he said. She did not smile, exactly. But the thing that moved through her chest when he said it was as close to one as she had felt in a very long time, and she kept it, and walked back into the firelight, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars, and she was entirely, exactly, irrevocably herself.